Hello F1 fans! Welcome back to the F1 Masters podcast brought to you by AUBG Daily. As usual, we're with myself, Harry, David and Vasco. And in this episode, we're going to discuss who we think the best drivers by decades are.
Before we begin, we have a special announcement to make. The F1 Masters team will be hosting a live F1 podcast event during the Qatar Grand Prix. This is going to happen in the BAC Auditorium on Sunday, the 1st of December. And we will be answering fans' questions live, having a live race watch-along, and hosting both a pre-race and post-race show where we'll be talking about what we think will happen and analyzing what happened during the Qatar Grand Prix. Stay tuned for more details about the event as these will be posted on AUBG Daily's social media channels. But now, back to the episode.
In this episode, as we said, we'll discuss who are our greatest pilots by decades in Formula 1. We'll start from the 1950s till these days. And what better place to start than 1950, the beginning of Formula 1? Who is your GOAT for the 1950s? I think we can all agree on one person. It's not even a debate, but let's just discuss it a bit, because 1950s, what a different time for Formula 1. In the beginning, everything was like, it was the caveman period of Formula 1, but I think one guy stood above the rest.
This is Juan Manuel Fangio, of course. He won 5 titles during that decade. He was impressive. He was the best above all of them.
Yeah, he held that record until 2003 when Michael Schumacher finally broke it, which was an unbelievable, long-lasting record, and also actually holds the record for the oldest world champion in history at 46 years old when he won his 5th championship. And also, I think most astonishingly, he won 5 championships with 4 different constructors, something that I don't think will be repeated anytime soon. And I mean, it hasn't been repeated since then. And I think it'll be very difficult to beat that. I mean, very competitive throughout the decade. Even in the 1950 season, he was very close to the title. Very consistent driver, El Maestro, as he's known as. And overall, just total domination of the 1950s. We had a few other drivers as well. If you want, Vasco, you can mention some of his other competitors.
Well, honorable mention, the first 2 titles of Ferrari with Alberto Ascari, who is very, very interesting to say, the first championship of, let's say, the greatest team in the sport were won by Italians. So there is some kind of symbolism in that. And 2 titles in the 2 consecutive titles. Before that, the first F1 champion ever, Giuseppe Farina. And after that, actually, the champion of 1959 and 1960, Jack Brabham. But nobody from them comes close to what Fangio was and to the legacy that Fangio had. So, do you have anything else to add on the team of the great Argentinian?
Well, I mean, I wanted to add about the decade that I think that we have to also mention Sterling Moss. Even though he didn't win any title, he's considered to be the best driver to never win a title. So I would like to mention him as well, because he was a really good driver who just sometimes didn't have the luck or the car. He even helped Mike Hawthorne with his 1958 title, because he went in front of the stewards and told them what actually happened. We can move on actually to the 1960s, and I'll start because I'll say that I think Graham Hill is the best driver of this decade. He won 2 titles, 1962 and 1968. The first one with BRM, second one with Lotus. He was, I would say, a consistent driver during the decade. He was almost always at the top of the field. He has a good record of wins. In his first championship winning season, he has 4. Second one, he has 3. Which isn't a lot from today's perspective, but still he was quite consistent. So yeah, guys, you can say yours now.
Graham Hill is very good. I was definitely considering him. Also, the fact, as he's known as Mr. Monaco, he won so many races there. And I would say, though, in Formula 1, because Graham Hill, he's also a great driver outside of Formula 1, only person to ever win the Triple Crown. But in Formula 1 specifically, I think greatest in 1960s decade is Jim Clark. And this is really come down to, I would say, something that he has so much pace. His qualifying pace was unbelievable, and in fact would regularly qualify at the front of the field even in his non-championship winning seasons, but due to reliability issues he wasn't able to win as many races as he could have in other seasons. But the seasons that he won, 1963 and 1965, in both seasons he won 100% of points available. The only other person to even achieve this once is Alberto Ascari, and I think that is an unbelievable achievement, and it's a shame that his life was cut short due to an accident, but his pace was really astounding, and I think he held the race win record at the end of his career, which was also very impressive at the time.
Well, just to put things into perspective, with when we compare Graham Hill and Jim Clark, there are 13 wins for Graham Hill compared to 25 wins by Jim Clark, but Graham Hill leads in podiums. He has 34 compared to 32 with Jim Clark, but in pole positions, this is where like Jim Clark stands above with 33 compared to only 13 for Graham Hill. And if for points, overall points, Jim Clark has 13 more points in his career, 857 compared to 844 for Graham Hill, and they both have 2 championships. Probably what makes the case interesting for Graham Hill is that he managed to win the championship with 2 different teams, but at the same time Jim Clark, when he had the car, when he had the reliable car, he was the best, and nobody even came close to him. So that is why I would have to give this decade to Jim Clark. But also some other honorable mentions. In my opinion, again, we have to mention Jack Brabham for his second time in a row, because 1960 title, 1966 title. Also, one of the strangely interesting pilots, if I can describe it like that, is John Surtees, because he not only for Formula One legacy, yeah, he has 1 title. He has been good for Ferrari, but also in other competitive fields in motorsports, he has been amazing. So that is why I think he is not close to the greatest of the decade debate, but he is probably the best overall motorsport driver of that decade.
Yeah, to add on your point about Surtees, he's actually the only ever champion in the top motorsport on both 4 wheels and 2 wheels in motorcycle racing, which I thought was incredibly impressive for him. And also to mention Jack Brabham, 1966, the only person ever to win the championship in his own car, which I think is also a feat that should not be overshadowed. But yeah, that's up all with the 1960s decade. Now we're moving on to another very competitive decade, and that was the 1970s. Let's start with Harry. Who do you have as your best of the decade?
Right, so I'm the only one with this take, but still I'm gonna defend myself, because I've said Emerson Fittipaldi. He won 2 titles with 2 different teams, similar to Graham Hill. 1972 with Lotus and 74 with McLaren. I mean, he was a truly special driver at the beginning of the decade, especially because when he had the machinery, he was not unbeatable, but really at the top of his game. Because, for example, 74, he won the title by only 3 points. It was like all decided in the last round of the championship, because he was equal on points with his main competitor before the final race, similar to 2021. After that, he created his own team and things went kind of in a downhill trajectory. But before that, I think he is a driver to consider for this decade. What do you guys think?
Absolutely. And when you look at the stats, they're pretty for the time being, the 70s, since the beginning till 1979. They're pretty close in every stat, and I was actually surprised to see that Emerson Fittipaldi entered more Grand Prix. They have the same number of championships, but I was surprised to see the difference between Niki Lauda and Emerson Fittipaldi once again in pole positions in that time frame, because 24 pole positions for Niki Lauda compared to only 6 for Emerson Fittipaldi. this is like a really serious difference. And in every other stat, actually, yeah, their titles, the number of titles that they have is the same in that period, but we know that Niki Lauda even comes close sometimes to gold debates, or at least top 5 in the history of F1. So that is why, with all my respect to Emerson Fittipaldi, I think that Niki Lauda is the guy of the 1970s.
Yeah, I have to agree with Vasco. I also believe that in 1976, if it wasn't for his accident, he would have had 3 consecutive championships and would have further cemented his legacy. Also, a few honorable mentions. Jackie Stewart did win 2 championships during this decade, but retired in 1973 after the death of his teammate Francois Cervera. And also, someone that actually never won a championship, but I would like to give him an honorable mention, and that is Ronnie Peterson. Very quick Swedish driver for Lotus and Tyrrell March for many years, but just never really got the chance to win the championship. He got close a few years, and 1978 was his best chance. He did drive the Lotus with Mario Andretti, but unfortunately was killed before the end of the season and didn't have a shot at winning the championship. Anything else to add? Yeah.
I think honorable mention should be given to the bad boy of F1, James Hunt, because probably it is because of the movie that created a special aura around him, but his legacy would probably never die, and he's the champion of 1976, one of the most dramatic seasons in F1, and his battle with Lauda is legendary. So I think he deserves an honorable mention, and probably the guy that challenged the greatest of this decade, in my opinion, Niki Lauda, the most compared to anybody else in that period. And if you can get inside Niki Lauda's skin, then you have something in you. Can we move to the 1980s?
Yeah, again, I'll start. And I've picked another Brazilian, interesting trend. Also, he has won titles with 2 constructors, once again. And this is Nelson Piquet, who won 3 titles, 81, 83, and 87, with the first with Brabham and the third one with Williams. And I think he was a really consistent driver during this decade. He was similar to, I would say, Graham Hill. He was always at the top of the field. He didn't have the car always, and there were like other drivers, as we'll see, Vasco and David will tell us. But I think that Nelson Piquet is a really good shout. He has a great record during this decade. He was consistent because the difference is 6 years between his first and his third title. So let's see what you guys have.
Well, interesting fact is that all his 3 titles are with different engines, which is like super weird, and with 2 different teams actually. But in that period, he was fascinating actually, and probably he and probably Fittipaldi before him, they started that legacy, that special feeling around Brazilian Formula 1 drivers. And I think it is still this day, when you see a pilot from Brazil, you have that special feeling. It's not only me, right?
No. Let's see how Bortoleto does.
Yeah, we'll see a lot of expectations on him. But also, again, talking stats, well, Alan Prost was, probably the GOAT of that decade. I'm not the biggest fan of him, but I cannot say that he wasn't great. And again, when we talk about, let's say, GOAT debates, top 5 debates of all time, he's always in the picture, and stats further prove about this. He has 21 more wins in that time period than Nelson Piquet, and he has 34 more podiums. But actually, the interesting stat is that Nelson Piquet has 4 more pole positions in that period, which is very interesting, because they have entered the same number of Grand Prix, and actually Nelson Piquet has had different engines, different teams. The same is for Prost. I think he won with 2 different engine providers, but he has always been, I think, in more favorable positions. Only we can make the case about the end of the decade, but before that, in 85, 86, and after that, Alan Prost has always been in more favorable positions. So for Nelson Piquet to have like four more pole positions and to have the same number of titles as Alan Prost is pretty respectable in my opinion. I think they're pretty close in that debate of the 80s, but I think Alan Prost, because of his legacy, because of his style of driving, I think that is what makes him edge that. And also one last thing, also how close was Alan Prost to having four championship, which would have cemented him as the greatest of the 80s. But I think was the difference 0.5 points?
0.5.
Yeah, 0.5 points in 84. So again, something just to think about it, because the qualities that Alan Prost had, they can never be undermined, and that is why I think he's the greatest of the 80s.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is Prost as well. First of all, Nelson Piquet also wanted to mention something is that in 1981 and 1983, he actually won the Drivers' Championship with not the Constructors' Champion in both instances, which is, I don't think anyone has actually ever done that apart from him, like to win two championships without having the best car. In 1981, Brabham finished second, and in 83, they finished third. But Alan Prost, it's for me because I think overall, every year, pretty much from 1982 to the end of the decade, he is in the championship fight, and I can't say the same about Nelson Piquet. Alan Prost actually could have won the championship with Renault 82 and 83. He had the best car, but the car would just break down every race. And yeah, as you mentioned about the championship where he lost by half a point, I just think Alan Prost is overall very consistent. His driving style kind of reminds me of Lewis Hamilton. It's like very calculated, very clean, like not that aggressive. And it's like he knows how to win championships, especially like his 1986 championship, for example, when he was up against Nigel Mansell and Nelson Piquet, actually, in the Williams, which was the best car that year. But Alan Prost managed to find a way to beat both of them. So I think Alan Prost deserves this award in our eyes, in my eyes.
You made me think with that if anybody ever managed to win two championships with cars that are not the best, and I think Kimi is the guy who came closest to this.
Well, McLaren got disqualified from the championship that year.
Yeah, actually, yeah, but he was not in the best car.
Yeah, but actually, I just realized if Max Verstappen wins the championship this year, he will also have two championships where the team did not win the constructors. So I think he will be the first person to actually equal this. So yeah.
Yeah, but he was in the same team, so like.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, true. So do we have honorable mentions for the 80s?
Yeah, honorable mentions. I would say actually Niki Lauda because he retired after I believe 1978, but he came back in 1982 and had a pretty successful stint with McLaren and managed to win a championship. Another honorable mention, Ayrton Senna, although he rose to fame towards the end of the decade, I think even when he wasn't in a championship winning car, for example with Lotus, he also proved to be very good. And finally, Nigel Mansell as well. Didn't win a championship in this decade, but was constantly in the championship battle.
All right. Then we move on to the 90s. And here, finally, I'm not going to be the single person with like the different take. Somebody's going to agree with me. Let's see. So my take is Ayrton Senna because he won two titles in the beginning of the decade and he was killed like 4 years after the beginning of the decade. So who knows, maybe he could have won more, similar to Jim Clark, let's say. And I mean, if we see his record like at the beginning of the decade, he was dominant with this McLaren Honda. He was heads and shoulders above the rest. And I think that he's a really good shout, even though there is another one, Vasco.
Well, for me, it is again Ayrton Senna. He's the driver with probably the best legacy in the sport because the aura around Senna and everything. When you say the name, you feel like this is Formula One. This is the history of Formula One. This is the legacy, and the way he drove, how relentless he was at times, but always so amazingly passionate. I think Senna should be considered not only the greatest of this decade, but for me he was always in the GOAT debate, and we can make a serious case for him, but especially for the 1990s, in my opinion, and also some very famous faces from the history of F1 have always mentioned that even though he won only two titles in the 1990 and 1991, in 92 and 93 this was his best seasons, because when he didn't have the best car and he was fighting for these positions, he was like crazy when he was driving. And that is actually when you prove your value, that when you don't have the best car, when you don't have the best conditions, but you're fighting till the end and you grab wins, you're just competitive even though everything is against you at that certain moment. And that is why I think Ayrton Senna is the greatest driver of the 1990s, even though he competed only in 4 seasons. 5 actually.
Senna is a good shout for sure. I mean, he is one of the greats, undoubtedly. But I think that the greatest of this decade is actually Michael Schumacher. And I mean, this is kind of difficult to say what Senna would have achieved if he did not have his crash. But Michael Schumacher's, I would say his longevity actually throughout this decade is a bit underrated, because it gets overshadowed by his post-2000s career. But Michael Schumacher, he won his first race in a Jordan in 1992 and was one of, I believe, only 3 other winners outside of the Williams team, which was incredibly dominant that year. And Michael Schumacher won 2 championships, but he was also very close to more championships. 1997, of course, down to the wire at the last race against Jacques Villeneuve. And in 1998, he was somewhat close to Mick Hakkinen. That was also decided on the last race of the season. And in 1999, he was once again in the title fight, but had a crash in Silverstone which broke his leg and missed the remainder of the season. Michael Schumacher, very consistent, I think, and he would drag that Ferrari, which was at the time in a long championship drought as it is in modern day F1, but their last world champion was in 1979, Jody Scheckter, and what Michael Schumacher did to revive this team I thought was spectacular, and he was making outstanding performances in a car that really didn't deserve to be at the front, but in the end he managed to compete for championships. And I think overall, he has competed at a higher level for a longer period of time than Senna during this decade, which is why I believe Michael Schumacher is the best of this decade.
I think we need to contextualize this a bit better, because for Senna, it was only the period till 1994, and we would have never known what would have happened. And actually, if we could have seen an actual title battle between Senna and Schumacher in the 1990s, but for the time period being when they competed on the same field, their stats are actually pretty equal. Senna has a bit more points with 635.5 compared to 617 to Schumacher, and this is only in the time period when they were on the same grid, when they were competing with each other. Senna has 5 more wins, has 7 more pole positions, but actually Schumacher has more podiums. And when we compare the cars that they were competing in, this is probably pretty understandable. So I just wanted to contextualize this.
Is this only until Senna's death? Or is this until the end of the decade?
This is until Senna's death.
Okay.
Yeah, that is why I wanted to compare them only when they were on the same grid, competing on the same field, because we don't really know what would have happened if Senna was still in the sport after that.
Yeah, but to be fair, that was probably some of the worst Schumacher cars during that decade, so it's kind of an, I would say, unfair comparison for Schumacher. But still, I guess agree to disagree. But now we'll move on to some decades that are really not up for debate, but we will still mention them since this is really the era of dominance in the 21st century. So in the 2000s, to no one's surprise, the GOAT for all three of us is Michael Schumacher. Does anyone want to say anything about this specific time period? And honorable mentions as well, I guess, since Michael Schumacher is clearly the best of this decade, but some other names that could have been also mentioned.
For sure, the only guy that stood out for this decade, his name is Fernando Alonso, the guy who managed to break the Ferrari dominance in the beginning of the decade, and the guy who was actually when he entered the sport, he was pretty fascinating to watch, and he managed again to get under Schumacher's skin at some point in that time. But for the rest, probably we should mention Jenson Button because what happened in 2009 only, and because the BAR story is like super interesting, but apart from that, I don't think that there is anybody who really stands out.
I'm gonna mention Kimi Raikkonen because he was competitive in both McLaren and Ferrari. He took the title in 2007, and I think that we shouldn't forget about him. He was a factor to consider during this decade. And we can move on to the 2010s. I'm gonna say Lewis Hamilton because for me he was the true GOAT of this decade. I think that there will be some debate maybe here, but David.
I also think it's Lewis Hamilton. I mean, not only does he have 5 championships during this decade, he also directly with, I would say, his biggest competition for this decade, Sebastian Vettel, he managed to beat him in 2 consecutive seasons when they had a direct fight for the title, which I think gives the edge to Lewis Hamilton.
I can agree with that. It's just that with Vettel there was something, and especially in the period when Red Bull were the dominant power, they were never as dominant as Mercedes were from 2014 onwards, and that is why I think that the 4 titles in that period of Sebastian Vettel are worth a bit more than the 5 titles that Lewis managed to win in that period, solely because of competition factors. And talking about 2010, 2012, it was Vettel with an amazing drives that managed to secure him the title, that managed to make him the youngest world champion and to put him in the history books of F1. And that is why I think that the argument about Vettel would have been even stronger for greatest of this decade if he managed to win at least 1 title in that Ferrari against Lewis Hamilton. And that is, in my opinion, the thing that ruins what he has achieved during that time period. But we all know what happened. We all know what stress, what problems in your team, and what competing against probably the greatest of all time, Lewis Hamilton, can cause to you. So that is my argument for Sebastian Vettel. I think that is like Hamilton, yeah, for sure. He has the stats, he has the wins, he was in the best car, he was always competitive. But for Vettel, it was that factor, that competition factor, and that he really proved it in times when it mattered, especially in the first part of the decade. That is why I think a case should be made for him.
Yeah, just to add on that, I think pretty much the deciding factor was that Lewis Hamilton managed to break down Sebastian Vettel mentally, and we saw this on track many times when he was driving for Ferrari. And that's why in the end he didn't manage to get that championship with Ferrari.
For honorable mention for this decade, I'm gonna say Nico Rosberg, only for his period from 2014 to 16.
Nico Rosberg was, I mean, jokes aside, Nico Rosberg is actually a great driver, and I think that his championship should not be undermined. It's just that like the people that he faced during this decade, Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton are all-time greats, and Nico Rosberg is just not in the same category.
He competed against 2 GOATs, against Schumacher and against Hamilton, and he managed to beat them both. So that is I think really serious case. But the interesting part is that we mentioned some of the most interesting what ifs in F1 history, and for me probably the two most interesting what ifs are what would have happened if Senna was alive during the 90s, and what would have happened if Nico Rosberg continued to race after 2016. But I guess we would never know. And can we move on to the last decade? And actually only 4 years have passed from that decade, but we have seen a total dominance in that decade. Some very interesting championship fights, especially probably the best for me, the best title decider ever, Abu Dhabi, Lewis Hamilton against Max Verstappen. But I think it is the undisputed greatest driver of the 2020s is Max Verstappen.
I think we can all agree here. It's one of the most boring decades of the sport so far, if not the most boring. And for honorable mentions, who can we say? Maybe for 2021, we can say Hamilton, maybe.
Well, Lewis Hamilton, but the fun part is that I don't even think we can have honorable mentions because nobody came close to him, and the people who came closest to him were again so far away from him, like talking about, let's say, Charles Leclerc or Lando Norris, and not even for a second it looked like, oh yeah, they actually can compete for that championship. So we'll see. There are 6 more years in that decade. We have regulations and we have a lot of unknowns like young pilots, new engine providers, how are teams going to be after 2026. So who knows, till 2030 we can like shoot this episode, we can discuss who was the best pilot of the 2020s, and the answer may be different.
Yeah, I mean,
who knows?
Sebastian Vettel won the first 4 championships of the 2010s, and he is not the greatest of that decade. So it shows that anything can change.
Yeah. So it is just up to the teams, up to the drivers, up to their talent to prove are they worthy. And in 2030 we'll revisit that episode and we'll see if we were correct for the 2020s. Or, I don't know, Verstappen will have like 10 titles till then. Only time will tell.
Yeah, I think this is all for today from us. We're looking forward to the next episode. Till then, like, subscribe and follow us on AUBG Daily on Instagram and Facebook. And stay tuned for more of our content. Thank you, and remember,
if you no longer go for a gap that exists,
you're no longer a racing driver.